Today's facilitators are Dr. Joseph Matus and Dr. Lyman Dukes III. Joseph W. Matus, PhD, is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, the Director of the Center on Post-Secondary Education and Disability, and a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology in the Nang School of Education at the University of Connecticut. He is co-editor of Preparing Students with Disabilities for College Success, a practical guide to transition planning. Dr. Lyman Dukes is an associate professor of special education at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. He is also principal investigator of Project 10, Transition Education Network, which is a transition-focused training and technical assistance center funded by the Florida Department of Education. He is co-editor of Preparing Students with Disabilities for College Success, a practical guide to transition planning. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Drs. Matus and Dukes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Joe Meadows, and before we get going, I want to congratulate Beacon College, their administrators, their faculty and staff, students and parents on 30 years of doing this fantastic work. It's really remarkable and so important for so many students. So congratulations. Yeah, round of applause for that. So Daryl did most of my introduction, so let me tell you some of the things about me that aren't on here. I've been in the field of disability services for college students with disabilities for actually now about 28 years. And what got me into it, I was a special education teacher and started to realize that there were a number of my family members and good friends who were very, very bright, very, very creative, but were struggling in the traditional academic world. And one didn't make it through college, went to several different colleges, bounced around. Two others made it through with some support, maybe delayed graduation. But that really inspired me to this is in 1991, to start to say, well, something's going on here, and this is a group of students whose needs aren't being met at all. So that kind of led me into my journey working in higher ed and disability. The other two things about me, I'm also a parent. I have a recent university graduate who's now in the Navy. I have a sophomore in college and a junior in high school. So really immersed in this entire process right now from a different perspective. And my fun fact I tell people is that at one point in my life, I was a temporary bodyguard for Lionel Richie. So.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for having us this morning. We're very excited to be here. As Mr. Owens mentioned, my name is Lyman Dukes. He did mention that I am PI of Project 10, and I just want to clarify that at one time that was the case. I'm currently not PI for any folks who may have affiliation with Project 10. I think that I will sort of follow in Joe's footsteps in terms of introducing myself and tell you a little bit about me. I was a special education teacher for a number of years. Again, professor of special ed at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Also a parent of 3 children. 2 of those are stepchildren. The 14-year-old, who is now in high school, has what we call a dual diagnosis, or what we also call twice exceptional. It really has been eye-opening from the perspective of a person who's been trained as a special educator to come at this from the role of parent now. I see the experience in a radically different way, excuse me, than I did simply as a professional. It really has allowed me to appreciate in a very deep way what families experience when trying to help your child be successful in life. So you may be wondering, first of all, what self-determination is, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But more importantly, how can we support students' growth in this skill set that we refer to as self-determination? For those of you that are professionals here or even families, with all the other responsibilities that we have, what is it that we can do on a day-to-day basis to incorporate the development on strategies on the part of our children or students? And in addition to that, what are practices in which we can engage, whether it be in the home, whether it be in an academic environment to help students develop these skills? And lastly, and something we'll talk a lot about in just a few minutes, is are there tools that we can use that might help us help students develop these skills that we refer to as self-determination skills?
And so to build on that, on your table you have some handouts with definitions of the components of self-determination. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But then there's also a gridded worksheet. As Daryl said, this is a workshop, so in a little while we are going to put you all to work and have you complete that form.
So prior to digging into the weeds of this topic, we want to share a few bits of humor. Is self-determination actually important? And clearly, both Joe and myself believe that it is. The reality is that for almost all of us, when we leave the high school setting, we are entering adult life. And in adult life, there are no lifeguards. Self-determination skills, we like to think of as sort of serving in the role of lifeguard for us as we enter adult life.
And in addition, students are getting a lot of advice from a range of different people, and it can make them feel like they're going in many different directions and they're not sure which is the right direction specifically for them. And so it can look like some of these signs up here, or in reality, it could look like something like this. Has anybody ever driven in Boston? Okay. So this is actually probably one of the more clearly marked signs in Boston. And interestingly enough, you know, I'm from that area, so I'm making fun of it, but driving up here today, did see a sign for two roads going in the same direction. One was north and one was south, right?
That's actually quite close by. We were just a few minutes away from here when we saw that. So now we're at the point where we want to talk a little bit about what it is that we're going to address for the remainder of our time here. Prior to that, I would like to get a sense for who we have in the audience. So I know that we have some families, and I know that we have some people that work in the field of college administration. Maybe we have some faculty. We may have some other community members here. So family members, parents, can we get a sense for who you are? We've got quite a few. That's very exciting to see. People that work in college environments. Got a number of those. People from the community. We've got just a few of those. Great. So thank you to you all for joining us this morning. What we're going to do is we're going to talk a bit about, first of all, what self-determination is and what its value is. In addition to that, as Joe indicated, we've taken advantage of the fact that this is called a workshop, and we're going to put you to work working with, trying out something that we've recently developed with a number of our colleagues that we refer to as the app tool. Again, that's on the table there for you to take a look at. App refers to activities, programs, and policies. So we're going to look at self-determination through that lens in just a moment. Just a bit of background before we dig into actually working with the tool itself, to give you a sense for who it is, at least in this case, who it is that we're serving on our campuses, and whether or not they actually choose to raise their hand as an individual with a disability on campus. So data tells us, and this is rather recent data, that nearly 2 in 10 students at traditional colleges and universities raise their hands and disclose to the Disability Services Office or Accessibility Service Office. They have a number of different titles depending upon the institution. Much more interestingly to us is that 7 in 10 have a diagnosis, leave the secondary school setting, and choose not to disclose the disability upon entry into post-secondary education. This means we have a large set of students at most institutions who need services or might benefit from services. I don't want to say that they would need. Many of them might need them. Many would benefit from them, but they choose not to disclose. Therefore, they're not eligible to receive them. We also know, based upon data, that these students are pursuing a wide range of degrees. They have interest in a diverse array of majors. And unfortunately, as you see at the bottom of this slide here, the vast majority don't persist to graduation. This is why registering with that office is so critically important to student success. What we know is students that do choose to register actually persist and graduate more often. Why is it so important to develop self-determination skills? There are stark differences between a high school environment and the typical college environment. First of all, beginning with legislation. The ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act apply in the college environment or in the post-secondary environment. IDEA applies in K-12. So there's a change in the legislation that protects students. Secondly, students themselves are responsible for seeking out an evaluation if they believe that they need one once leaving the K-12 setting. If a student is believed to have a disability in the K-12 environment, it is the school's responsibility to assist that student to make that determination. Again, we see what's offered to a student with disability, special education in K-12 that does not exist in post-secondary environments. Students will receive reasonable accommodations on a course-by-course basis if they're deemed eligible for them. Excuse me, I'm still overcoming the flu, actually. Early flu this year, unfortunately. Who serves as the primary advocate? The student, once they leave K-12. And progress monitoring, again, is incumbent upon the student. If the student is not doing well in a post-secondary environment, typically, many institutions don't have people that will reach out. Self-determination, what is it? We're going to talk a little bit about the literature. There are actually two parallel lines of research that have developed surrounding self-determination in the higher education literature. One is called self-determination theory. One is simply referred to as self-determination. We're going to talk primarily, and we're really looking at this through the lens of self-determination. However, if you look at the literature itself, what you find is that the conclusions to which they come are basically the same, and that is that students who have self-determination skills, who possess these skills that we're talking about, do better both in college and subsequently in adult life settings. The difference between these two is that self-determination theory has primarily been examined at the post-secondary level, whereas self-determination bubbled up through the K-12 literature initially, and then was subsequently applied in post-secondary settings. Definition, we finally get to exactly what this is. It's pretty straightforward. We're talking about a set of skills, knowledge, and beliefs that enable a person to engage in goal-directed, self-regulated, and autonomous behavior. So these are your skills, right? Engaging in goal-directed behavior, you're able to manage yourself. You can do so relatively autonomously. You have an understanding of your strengths and limitations. So again, that's sort of your knowledge. What am I good at? What do I need to become better at? And then beliefs. So here we get into the notion of internal locus of control, and that is this idea that oneself, is capable of being successful in a post-secondary environment in this case. Self-determination is rather complex in terms of the elements that make it up. It's made up of a number of different component skills, and those are spelled out here. We're talking about the ability to make choices, the ability to decision make. So to me, this sort of means the idea of can you create sort of a menu of choice options? Goal setting, again, relative independence, recognizing the need to be interdependent on occasion, engaging in safe risk-taking, well-thought-out risk-taking, and then we move a little further down and we see self-advocacy. So again, this idea to be able to raise one's hand, if you will, when entering a post-secondary environment and letting that accessibility services office know that you're on campus and you may need support from them from time to time. So Dr. Modaus and myself began this, this path quite a few years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, in which we wanted to examine all of the literature that had ever been published related to students with disabilities in higher education. So as we began to take a look at this, this literature goes back as far as the early 1950s. It was the year 2012 when we initially began this examination of the literature, and we did so by gathering it all up and then attempting to make sense of it. So we're talking about self-determination this morning. That is simply one small subdomain, if you will, of this larger literature map that we developed. So when looking specifically at the literature on self-determination, we went back to that original data gathering process that we did, and we pulled or culled from that all of the literature from the early 50s to 2012 that referenced self-determination. When we decided to look at self-determination, it was around 2015, so we again went back and specifically looked for more recent literature, specifically on self-determination. And then third, we did a hand search of relevant journals to make sure that we hadn't missed anything. Because that original literature map was so large, we developed a taxonomy to organize all of that literature, and that's what you're looking at here. So it's called the PAS taxonomy. That stands for Post-Secondary Access and Student Success. We organized all of that literature under these 4 domains. The self-determination literature falls under the student-focused support domain. That's where most of the self-determination literature falls. Well, a couple of other things about the taxonomy. It really is intended, number one, as I said, to organize the literature, but also allow us to more easily discuss and research topics related to post-secondary education for students that have a diagnosis. It's a bit challenging to see, but what this is it's a reference to, or at least alludes to, those component skills that we looked at a moment ago, and sort of tells us what the topical areas that are actually within the self-determination literature. The upshot here is that most are on self-determination generally or on self-advocacy. This bar graph here indicates that we had about 100 publications on self-determination. Most of them are what we call database. That means they presented original data. And as you can see here, we have a significant increase around the beginning, or the turn of the century, the beginning of the 21st century, in which we see quite a few publications that are data-based in nature. Again, this is simply a reference to the types of methodologies used in those data-based studies. The most important takeaway here is very few are experimental, so we're not really looking in a very deep or meaningful way yet at what may actually work for students in any experimental way. And then the sample sizes here simply reference the fact that most of these experiments, or most of the publications that present original data, including the experiments, have very modest sample sizes.
So in terms of what we found, the general summary is that students with disabilities tend to have issues with self-regulation skills and also with self-efficacy skills. And what's interesting about the self-efficacy skills literature is that in some cases, students with disabilities are actually overestimating their perceived ability to perform particularly some academic tasks. There are studies that look at students right as they're transitioning in, and certainly a lot of the students I worked with would talk about, I've got this, I'll do great in this course, but they really didn't have the strategies to do so. So that's kind of an interesting finding that comes up. The literature also points, particularly the qualitative work that interviewed students with disabilities, points very clearly for the need for students to have a strong self-voice, to be able to talk about their strengths and their weaknesses, their needs, et cetera, and to be able to communicate that to others, and importantly, be able to communicate that to their peers. That was another thing that came up, communicating with their peers if they live in a residential hall. And how do you talk to your roommate about the fact that you have a learning disability? What does that mean? Why do you get extra time on a test where someone else doesn't? So those were some issues that definitely surfaced. And likewise, the other issue that came up in talking to was communicating with faculty, and a lot of students not wanting to communicate with faculty because they were afraid that they would be perceived as a fraud, that they were somehow gaming the system and getting an unfair advantage. So the students in those focus groups really talked about the need to have those skills to be able to address those very, very important issues related to stigma. The literature also very clearly points to the fact, though, that these skills can be taught, and also to the fact that this should happen as early as possible, certainly in high school, earlier if possible. Unfortunately, sometimes in secondary transition, we don't really start to address these issues until it's not legally mandated until the students are 16, and certainly that's way too late. So as early as possible, students should be thinking about these skills and having opportunities to develop these. So students, again, I talked about this being able to accept the disabilities, know their strengths, weaknesses, and preferences, articulate that to others, be able to deal with stigma, et cetera. And it's also, the literature also points out the fact that it's very important for students to be academically and socially involved when they go to college. Some large-scale studies have pointed to the fact that students who are involved are more likely to be retained into the sophomore year and then to move on to graduation because they feel a sense of connection with the institution. And that can take the form of working with professors one-on-one or going to seek out academic supports, joining clubs, et cetera. So it's the students who were not engaged, the students who didn't, oftentimes the commuters, unfortunately, too, who didn't have that sense of affiliation with the institution tend to not do as well. And so, again, the bottom line is it's important for students to be able to seek out services and seek out affinity groups, peer groups, et cetera, to really help develop that success. So what we're hoping to show you is this app tool, or what we're going to show you is this app tool, and now it's time for you to go to work. And you have a copy of it. I think the first page on yours is a model one that was completed. So I'd like you to not cheat and flip that over to the next page, to the blank one. And if you look at that left-hand column, what we'd like you to do is to list out in your experience 5 to 7 common challenges that are faced by college freshmen. Now, if you don't have experience in that area, list out 5 to 7 common challenges faced by young adults who are leaving college and going into employment. List out 5 to 7 common challenges or concerns that you have about a student who's in high school getting ready to go to college. So you can adapt this tool to your own particular perspective. So what we'd like you to do, we're going to give you a couple minutes, list those out, and then we're going to do this is the think part. Then we're going to have you pair up with some people at your table and share and see what you have in common, what was unique, and you can discuss that for a couple minutes. So take a few minutes and take a look at that first column.
If you have any questions, please don't hesitate just to raise a hand, and we'll come by and answer any questions you may have.
Well, would it be okay with you if we put that in the parking lot for a second and we'll focus on this, and then we're going to open everything up to questions at the end? Yeah. Thank you. Those are good questions. So remember, after you complete your list, please start to talk to the people around you and share your, see what you have in common, what was unique.
And again, as Joe mentioned, from the parent perspective, you obviously have had your own experience with your child, either looking at colleges or looking at employment, thinking about that if you have a teenage son or daughter. So from that perspective, this is great too.
So if you could take another minute on this discussion, and then we'll move to the next column. Okay, so now we'd like to draw your attention to the second column. And in the second column, I'd like you to think about different activities, policies, or procedures. For those of you who are in the college environment, what are those different activities, policies, procedures? This would also be true for people at the high school level that are very, missing something here. There we go. 5 or 10 of the most favorite or popular or effective activities. What do the students really like to do? And these don't have to be specific to students with disabilities. These could be broader. If you're family members, you could think about what are activities that you're doing at home or activities that you're doing to help prepare your son or daughter to go to college. So think about it again through the perspective that you bring. As we note here on the slide, it's useful to list the activity next to one of the challenges, but it's not necessary. Okay, so you can line it up that way if you want, but it's not necessary. So again, take a few minutes, think about those activities, policies, procedures, events, and then we'll have you talk again to each other and share some ideas.
So just as a quick example from the perspective of a parent, right? One of the issues that my stepson has is he completes homework and it never makes it to school, right? So we talk about this at length at home. So there are practices in which we engage at home that are designed to, first of all, help him get the homework there, but secondly, designed to put him in the position of having to manage that process himself. So that would be an example of what kind of strategy or practice do we use at home that help to support this idea of the development of self-determination skills.
Thank you. Okay, so then the next step would be to consider those apps and looking at the key at the bottom that has the self-determination skills. Can you code the apps, the activities, policies, procedures, events, etc., with the different components of self-determination? And you have the components and the definitions. So see if you can just see how it lines up with those components and put the number in the upper corner there. If you don't, if there's a component that you don't use, you could circle that, and then we'll reflect on ways that that might be used in the future.
Does that make sense to everyone? No? Okay. So the idea here is that what you're doing is whatever activity or practice, if you're a professional and you've listed a policy here, what you're doing is reflecting upon that particular program or policy or activity or practice and thinking about whether or not the way in which that happens, the way in which you engage in that practice, does it provide the opportunity for students to engage in these particular skill sets? So are students being provided in a first-year camp, in this case, as we're looking at that example, does it provide the opportunity for students to problem solve or to goal set or to engage in some sort of self-awareness process? So in the case of a first-year camp at my institution, I can very, very clearly think through that particular program and recognize that one of the elements of it is to have students goal set for the upcoming semester. How do I goal set? Once I know how to goal set, what are in fact my goals? So that would be an activity that would happen within that particular program in which we're prompting students to engage in self-determined behavior. That's what we're talking about here. And again, we do the same thing at home. I'll talk about that in just a moment.
So I know I'm rushing you a little bit, but we're getting short on time, so we'll come back to the discussion. But I just want you to think about, were there any self-determination components that aren't being used? Are there any activities, programs, or policies that don't line up with any elements of self-determination? And I'll show you this. We've been piloting this tool throughout the country over the past year. We've done it with student affairs professionals in higher education. We've done it with disability service providers. And this is some of the feedback that they've shared, is that it's helped for them to surface some very popular activities with and say, well, wait a minute, we've just always done this. We need to really examine, why are we doing this, and how does it relate to getting students the skills that we want them to have. So this idea of looking at outcomes, helping to surface these outcomes that might not be being hit, evaluating what outcomes are being missed. Another thing is, it's a nice way to currently look at what we're currently doing and improve them to increase these skill sets of self-determination. We also heard a lot that this was very useful as a program evaluation tool, and the participants didn't see this specifically for students with disabilities. They saw this as important for all college students. That idea of teaching these self-determination skills and using this tool as a way to evaluate activities and make sure that there are elements of self-determination infused into those activities so they're more beneficial for students. So a number of participants talked about this in terms of assessment. So I'm not going to bore you with the specifics of the quote because we want to move on to questions for you. Would anybody like to share any of the activities or events that could be used to foster student self-determination?
And if you would, just raise your hand and I'll quickly come over.
I have a very fundamental question that puzzles me. I think all of these listings, the numbers that down here, are excellent qualities and fit very well for implementing in a college setting. But if you're talking about the Beacon student body who arrives on campus and has experienced 6 to 8 years of social abuse and has been kicked around, dragged through the mud, and teased as well as being bullied, the confidence level, personal, private confidence level is about zero. The last thing that they're interested in is self-determination. Their immediate goals have to be some way of acquiring personal security and overcoming their insecurity. And only after that is done can you even approach the concept of taking a risk by asking a question, taking a risk by going to the teacher for some question, or I don't know how this works, but I'm too afraid to make, I'll just listen and learn as it goes. At the end at Beacon, they've made friends for the very first time. And only at the end of such a close personal experience in a good college where it is a community, and gosh, there's a lot of people around here who were scared like me when I started and all of that, they begin to have the private confidence of approaching the problems you're looking at here. But for many students, it takes more than 2 years to overcome the private confidence element and then be able to understand what you mean by self-advocacy in its greater terms.
I completely agree with you. And when I think of students with disabilities, I also think about a continuum, like was discussed earlier, that some students need to have those very basic skills met first or needs met first before they can start to develop some of these skills. Other students come in with maybe a little bit more confidence or a little bit more ability. And so the idea in any case is what we're trying to promote is ways that these elements can be infused into programs, not just individualized while you're working with one student one-on-one, but are there ways that you have these activities that are going on that could build in elements of the concepts of the components of self-determination, kind of a universal design approach to it, if you will.
Thank you for that comment. I completely agree. Two quick remarks with regard to that. One, as a sixth grade teacher of a set of students who had not passed sixth grade the year before, I was coming in to the school for the first time and was told that these students would be with me all day long. And the kind of trauma that I sensed immediately from them communicated to me precisely what you're describing. And it became self-evident to me that what they needed first was an environment of trust. And that's what we worked on. And we slowly moved into some of the academic needs that they had following that. I couldn't agree more with your position regarding sort of where this should be thought about in terms of many of the needs that students have. Secondly, the thing that comes to mind is the University of Connecticut, where we were both trained. One of our first, jobs was working as learning specialists in a very structured program for students with learning disabilities called UpLD, in which students were expected to be present at least once per week, if not more, with the idea of developing independence, from semester to semester and year to year, with the goal of hopefully finding them in the place of, first of all, graduation, and then secondly, hoping that they've also developed some of the component skills that we're talking about here.
Yeah, really, it was kind of one of the early versions of the triangle that you see in special education now, where The students were getting a great amount of support early on, 1 or 2 times a week in that case, and then moving to maybe 1 or 2 times a month, and then maybe moving towards once or twice a semester, but only as they were ready to do it. And it took a lot of individual reflection on the part of the student. I know we're getting short on time, so I will just leave you these questions to reflect on, and then we'll just open this up for any questions that you have for us.
Oh, hi. Uh, yeah. I'm a parent of a freshman who just started. He has a
Congratulations.
diagnosis of he's within the autistic spectrum, and also ADHD. Has a big issue with focus. So besides the issue of trust, which I agree with you 100%, there's also, for those who have ADHD, an issue, a huge challenge with focus. They come from high school where there's a very structured environment, perhaps a special education program. Even if they're integrated, they give them a lot of attention. Then they come home, and we pay a lot of attention to them. So now they arrive in college, and many, at least with my son, they're at a total loss where to go, and that has to do with problem solving and many other of the elements that you identified. One tool that I found very effective, and that the other professor mentioned, is the learning specialist. To have a sort of mentor that can help problem solve, but also plan and organize their schedule and their daily activities. I guess my question regarding the learning specialists, the level of engagement, because it may be that when they're starting, just once a week is not enough. It depends on the student. Right. It may be that they need to have their cell phone so that at any time they can pick up the phone and call that learning specialist. What should be the workload of, or how many kids, students, should that learning specialist manage to have enough time to pay that personalized attention?
So really good question, and one of the issues that we face in regard to this question is related to what the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 require and don't require of colleges. And one of the things is working with a learning specialist one-on-one. The ADA and 504 only require that colleges provide reasonable accommodations and auxiliary aids. Now, colleges can go beyond that and provide the learning specialist, but if they do so, they can also charge an additional fee for those services. So in terms of workload, that will depend completely on the model that the institution has in place and the resources that are available. We carried loads of probably 8 to 10 students at that direct instruction level. We were working 20 hours a week. So, it's a well-resourced office. Maybe they're handling 15, 20, but in reality, they're probably handling way more than that. And the question is, what can they do in that regard to get the services that the student really needs? So, you raise a really very, very important point, and that points to that chasm between IDEA and ADA and 504 that Lyman talked about earlier. Do you want to jump in? Okay.
Thank you. I want to tag on what both of these gentlemen said. I do think that the individual student has different needs, and if a student, for example, is coming as a transfer student, then you can kind of make the assumption that something went wrong at the other university, even if they self-identified as a student with disabilities, as my son did. And so that, had he come straight from his high school where it was like Beacon, all for students with learning disabilities, he would have come here with more self-confidence. But the 2 years at the other university kind of took all that out of him. And so I do have a question as to whether once a week is enough, both for building back up his self-confidence, but also he does have ADD, so he has the time management issues and all that. And so between weeks, it's really, not enough. And he's the kind of kid who would say, oh, everything's fine. Right. And so, and he's not a very good self-advocate. And so, you know, I think there are kids who do fall between the cracks, and I think having them join activities is a fantastic idea, but when we filled out the column next to it as to how you do that and how you do it with self-determination, I didn't really have a good answer for that. I don't know what your advice would be, for example, on that one.
I don't know.
I
So, I mean, again, the question, these are somewhat difficult to answer, not knowing the particular student and not knowing the particular, you know, because there's such a range of demands in different types of post-secondary institutions. It's hard to come up with a singular answer for the types of challenges. Every student's different. Every student has those strengths and weaknesses, and every environment has different demands. So finding that balance, and it sounds like your son has found it here now, and that's wonderful. But you know, in terms of the learning specialist, again, it comes down to resources, and unfortunately, many colleges just don't have that available.
So one of the slides, excuse me again, that we skipped past and we didn't get to cover related to parents. And again, I've had this very different experience now over the last decade that I didn't have previously as it relates to this very important work that so many of us do. What you see near the bottom here is this idea of visiting colleges and examining and evaluating these. For parents who are in this place, it is critical to engage in this process of finding out what the particular institution offers. And there are vast differences. For many students, Beacon is an ideal environment in which to be educated. Some other students might decide that an institution of this nature is too small. They want a larger school experience. I know that for my daughter, she's looking at something like that. So again, it comes down to figuring out and making some decisions about what may be that ideal match. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort, and it may take some visits. It may take time on the phone. But obviously, it's critically important to do. How much time do we have remaining?
And when you look at the websites, be very critical of those. Ask questions afterwards, because as someone who used to fill out the survey that would go into the websites or the resource guides, there's great variability. So definitely follow up on that.
We have one back here. Of course, of course.
Thank you. So on the issue of getting your student involved in groups and activities, as I said, we were drawing a blank as to which of the numbered items below would sort of relate to that. Is there a right answer? Because it's one thing to say, oh, it's a really great idea to become involved in one of the groups as opposed to just hanging with friends. And I know when my daughter went to college, it made a difference, but I don't know which of these, besides saying to our son it's a good idea, how you do that. So that's why that was really part of what my question is.
Well, yeah, as a parent of 3, I don't really know the answer to that either, because I can suggest, you should get in. What, are you kidding me, Dad? But what we're hoping to do with this tool is that college administrators and disability service providers and people in student affairs can think about those types of issues and what types of things can they do to draw more students in and to get them engaged in the activities, so that they're not excluding a group of students, that they're being more inclusive. So that's really one of our goals, is to have this be an institutional reflection. We're thinking, and we've heard the feedback from the focus groups, that it could be done at the program level, it could be at the student affairs broader level, and people are talking about doing it at the institutional level as well.
So what I would add to that, again, I would go back to what we're looking at here and allude to what I said a moment ago. With your son or daughter, ask them in advance, what are your interests? What do you think you might want to do in terms of some sort of extracurricular activity when you get there? Does it exist at the institution we're looking at? Is there an opportunity, if you're at the school, to speak to another student who might be a part of that organization? Again, it's work in advance that ideally translates to a reasonably good match for the student and the institution that he or she chooses to go to. Mr. Heller?
Both have actually validated what I have done for the last 2 months, and that is to speak with both parents and students about the next step after high school and self-advocacy. I wanted to return to the one question that I had, and I was referencing a book by Elizabeth Hamlet where she has mentioned that it would be a good idea for high schools to have college fairs that would be dedicated to students with learning differences. However, I could see where that might be a gray area because of students not wanting to mention, their disability and so forth. But have you had any occasion to see these things happening?
Yeah, I have. For example, in New York, the area educational collaborators, BOSIS, they would have these things once or twice a year where they would invite people from disability services offices to go down and present to students on a regional basis. I've done a number of presentations representing both Mitchell College, where I was before UConn, and then UConn, where I'd go to high schools and talk to parents and students. It's a wonderful idea. The issue comes down to resources as well, because when you're in a disability services office, we were talking before about how many learning specialists there should be, but a lot of times there's it's a shop of one or maybe two people, and they've got all these students that they're working with, and now they're going to have to go out to different high schools. As wonderful as an idea it is, it becomes just difficult to do. So, but I think it's a great idea if it could be carried out.
Good morning. I have a question about the activities and policies and programs.
Yeah.
For this. I'm a parent of actually parent of two students at Beacon, and I also happen to be an education program and policy analyst. So I'm interested in that policy program part of things. And so I had no problem filling out the common challenges, no problem at all. But I didn't know what to put for the activities, programs, and policy, except that I put what Beacon does. So my question is, how do, and maybe people who work in higher education know this, but I suspect the answer is they don't. The question is, where is that information about what promising and effective policies and programs and activities are? Where does it reside? How do we share those best practices? And how do we learn from places such as Beacon?
Well, we try to, for example, my center at UConn, we run an annual institute where we bring in disability service providers from around the country and Canada to share best practices, best ideas. Wanda, who you'll hear from later, has spoken at our event. So we really try to get people together to share those ideas, to take them back to their institutions. One of the things we found looking at the literature is that there are examples of what are called best practices, but right now we don't know how much empirical support there is for that. It might work at one institution, but we don't know yet how it works at another institution when you factor in the variables of size and the competitiveness of the courses, et cetera, and the needs of the student. So you raise a really important question, and one that we're continuing to try to push that stone, but that's a big stone and it's going uphill. And but we're continuing to try that, and like Wanda's doing that kind of work as well, and trying to publish that, get that information out to as many people as possible.
In trying to understand self-determination, it seems to me that one of the critical or early stage issues is self-awareness. And how do you attack self-awareness? How much encouragement do you give to giving great detail to the students and so forth? And how do you feel about that?
Again, I think that so that comes down again to knowing the student a little bit and adjusting the approach. Some students a lot of the college students that I worked with, for example, had never had their disability documentation explained to them. And when I could sit down with them and talk about that and show them importantly, what their strengths were. When I would say to them just, well, can you describe your learning disability? They would typically go into the deficit part of it and what I can't do, because that's what they've been hearing and that's what they've been experiencing. So when we could map out and show them, okay, these are your strengths, these are the things you're good at, that was really enlightening for many of the students. And the fact that it took till college before somebody sat down and explained that information to them was really interesting to me and mind-blowing. But there are some students at the high school level who are ready for that, others who just are not. So you have to know the student and know what they're ready for at a given time. The point earlier in terms of making sure you're meeting that student's basic needs first, and then start to build that trust and explain the different components.
This is why making a match between the student and the post-secondary institution is so important. I am confident that a lot of what you describe is addressed here at Beacon. I don't know Beacon's program in great detail, but I am confident that that's something that's addressed. There may be other students that don't need it as critically, as Joe mentioned, again referencing my experience as a 6th grade special educator. One of the first questions I asked the students when I got in front of them is, why are you here? Do you know why you're in this room? And they thought SLD, specific learning disability at the time, meant slow learning disability. So again, as Joe mentioned, it was all about deficits. So we began the year by ensuring that we understood why the students were in the room and what their capabilities might be. So that was the need of that particular set of students at the time. And again, that's why making that match becomes so important.
Daryl, how are we doing, Daryl?
We have time for one more good question.
Okay. Well, good question.
Last
They've
but
all
not
been
least.
good. They've all been good.
I realize what you're looking at is more traditional education, but I wonder if you could comment on technical schools and also computer-based college courses as to whether or not they, in your opinion, in your studies, seem to be able to give the student enough of a career boost and a confidence boost for further life.
So I don't have a lot of experience in the technical school area, but I can tell you that in that literature that we looked at, there's not a lot, if really any, articles on the tech schools. So it's definitely an area that's been neglected in the literature and should be addressed. In terms of the online pieces, I hate to cop out on this, but that's going to depend entirely on the instructor and how they've structured that course. And are they using components of universal design and creating this online community? That, from what I've read and from when I've taught online courses, that sense of an online community is critical, as opposed to, okay, Lyman, here's your things to read, now do this online quiz and post, and you never have interaction with the rest of the group. So it really, the idea of course design is really critically important, in addition to accessibility for students with different types of sensory disabilities working in the online environment. But really, that infusion of universal design components into the instruction is critical.
I would simply add that, and I'm speaking anecdotally when I address the technical education piece of your question, absolutely that's a good match for many students, whether they have a diagnosis or not. It again puts that student, that young adult in a post-secondary environment, hopefully in which they're pursuing some sort of career of interest, right? And we want to always support students' desires to continue their education and continue their growth into adult life. In terms of the computer-based education piece, excuse me, around 2008, I was asked to begin teaching online courses at the University of South Florida, and there was virtually no support for the development of these courses. That's changed considerably since then. But in order to educate myself so that I could do so effectively as a quality educator, knowing what I know about special education, I began to devour the literature in the area and have since been publishing in this field now. It is burgeoning. We know every semester, every year, there are more and more students pursuing, if not a fully online degree, at least a significant portion of their degree program in an online environment. And as Joe indicated, it is incumbent upon the instructor and the institution to ensure that that online course is designed in such a way that it does meet the set of standards that exist currently. There aren't very many, but it should address those standards. And above and beyond that, for those of us like myself who do understand how to effectively educate students who learn in a unique manner, that we ensure that that's reflected in our course design and delivery.
So I'd like to thank you all again for inviting us here to spend time with you and for being such an engaged audience. And I wish you a wonderful day for some great speakers coming up too. So thank you again.